"Leave with empty hands," Thomas Bradford told his wife. "You came with one case. You'll leave with the same." Emily Winthrop did not cry. She did not beg. She picked up that case, walked to the door, and said 7 words that would cost him everything he thought he owned. She had saved his estate, his fortune, his future. He had never once noticed. If you've ever poured your heart into someone who couldn't see your worth, you'll understand every word of this story. Subscribe to our channel and tell us, what city are you watching from tonight? Emily Winthrop was already standing in the estate office when Thomas Bradford walked in. She had not knocked. She had not waited to be summoned. She had risen at 5, dressed without calling for Margaret, picked up the travel case she had packed the night before, and walked herself down the corridor and through the office door, because she had decided sometime around 3 in the morning that the last thing she would do in this house was wait for a man to tell her she could enter a room. The case was at her feet. Her coat was buttoned to the throat. Her face was composed with the specific stillness of a woman who has made a decision and intends to keep it. Thomas stopped when he saw her. Something crossed his face, fast gone before it could be named, and then the familiar, careful blankness settled back into place, and he crossed to his desk and sat down as though he had expected exactly this and was entirely untroubled by it. "You are leaving," he said. "Yes." He opened the desk drawer, and here was the thing Emily had not expected, the thing that hit her harder than anything else that morning. Harder than the cold of the unlit fire. Harder than the silence of a house that had stopped feeling like hers weeks ago. The document he removed was already prepared, already written, already sealed with the Bradford crest. He had prepared it before she told him she was going. He had known. Or he had decided for her, which was worse. She kept her face still. He placed the document on the desk between them with the precision of a man completing a transaction he has already reviewed. "You leave with what you arrived with," he said. "One case, your clothing, your personal correspondence. Nothing belonging to Bradford Estate passes through that door with you." The room was very quiet. Emily looked at the document. She looked at the man behind it. She had spent 11 months learning to read Thomas Bradford, his silences, his evasions, the precise architecture of his self-containment, and she read him clearly now. He was not angry. He was not relieved. He was performing the very specific emotional neutrality of a man who has decided that feeling nothing is the same as being safe, and has been practicing that decision for so long, he has almost convinced himself it's true. "I understand, Mr. Bradford," she said. He had expected something else. She could see it in the slight tension around his jaw, that small involuntary tightening that happened whenever reality failed to cooperate with his expectations. He had expected tears. An argument. The particular desperation of a woman who had nowhere else to go. He did not know Emily Winthrop as well as he believed. She picked up the case. She turned toward the door. "Mrs. Bradford." She stopped. She did not turn. "You will tell the household you are departing due to personal circumstances." His voice was entirely level. "You will not discuss the particulars with anyone on the staff." A pause. Emily turned. "I will tell them goodbye," she said. "Nothing more." He gave a single nod, the nod of a man approving a minor household decision, and looked back at his desk. She was already dismissed. She understood that. She had understood it for some time. She took one step toward the door. Then she stopped again. She had told herself she would not say it. She had argued with herself through 4 days of rain and 4 long nights in the guest room, where she had moved herself 3 weeks ago, and she had decided firmly, finally, that she would walk out of Bradford Estate with her dignity intact and her mouth shut. But she was 26 years old. She had given 11 months of her life to this place and to this man, and some truths refuse to stay silent, no matter how firmly you decide to keep them that way. "There is one thing you should know." Thomas looked up. "I never wanted your fortune." Her voice was steady, not cold, just honest, the way a person sounds when they have stopped hoping to be understood and are speaking only for the record. "I never wanted the estate. I never wanted anything that belonged to you." He said nothing. "I wanted the man I believed existed beneath all of it." She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. "I was wrong about him, but I was not wrong to look." She walked out. The door closed behind her. Not slammed, not thrown. Closed with the same quiet precision Emily applied to everything. Thomas sat alone in the estate office. He told himself he felt nothing. He was very nearly right. Margaret Pierce had been a lady's maid for 9 years, and in those 9 years she had learned that the wisest thing she could do in any household was keep her expressions neutral and her opinions to herself. She broke that rule the moment Emily appeared at the top of the stairs. "He can't be serious." The words came out before she could stop them loud enough that the footman at the end of the hall turned around. Emily set down the case and took Margaret's hands in both of hers. "Hi is." Emily's grip was firm and warm and entirely steady. "And it's all right." "It is not all right." Margaret's voice dropped to a fierce whisper. "You've worked yourself half to death for this place. The accounts the tenant disputes the harvest shortfall. None of it gets fixed without you, and anyone with eyes can see it." "Margaret." The maid stopped. "Do not say anything to him." Emily's tone was gentle but unmistakable. "Not today. Not after I'm gone. Promise me." Margaret's jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright with the fury of someone who has witnessed an injustice and has been asked for reasons that make sense and that she resents completely to hold her tongue. "You are too good for this house," Margaret said. Emily almost smiled. Almost. "The Crawley family," she said. "Eastfield. Their winter allotment was approved 3 weeks ago, but the order got lost between the steward's office and the supply ledger. Tell Mr. Davies to look for it under the September accounts." Margaret stared at her. "You're leaving, and your last instruction is about a supply ledger. Someone needs to make sure the Crawleys have firewood before December." The hired coach was cold. The driver said nothing. The road to Harrogate took 4.5 hours through rain that had finally stopped, leaving Yorkshire washed and grey and indifferent. Emily sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the countryside move past the window. She did not cry. She had made a firm decision about that, and unlike the decision about keeping silent, this one she kept. What she allowed herself in that cold coach was something quieter, something more honest than tears. She allowed herself to remember. She had arrived at Bradford Estate on a Tuesday morning in late January, 11 months ago. Cold weather, dry roads, a young woman of 26 who was not naive and did not expect love, but believed with the quiet conviction of someone who has always found a way to make things work in the possibility of goodwill on both sides. Thomas Bradford had met her at the entrance with the household staff arranged in a formal line. He had shown her to her rooms. He had explained over a dinner that was excellent and deeply silent the organization of the estate and his expectations. He had not asked a single question about her. Emily had made a mental note of that. She had also noted the dinner service was understaffed, the silverware inadequately polished, and the household accounts ledger she had been shown before the meal contained at least 2 expenditure categories that did not correspond to any operational function she could identify. She had not mentioned any of this, not yet. Instead, she had looked at Thomas Bradford across the dinner table and said, "Tell me about the tenants." He had looked up with mild surprise. "They are managed by the estate steward." "Of course. But you must know the families yourself, the ones who have been on Bradford land the longest." He had named 3 families. Correctly names, locations, tenure. He knew his estate the way a man knows a balance sheet in figures and categories in terms of what produces and what costs. Emily had noted that too. She had spent her first week watching, her second week learning. By the third week, she had begun quietly without announcing her intentions to anyone to fix things. The household supply chain was first. Bradford Estate was spending 30% more than necessary on basic provisions because the purchasing ran through 3 separate vendors with overlapping accounts and no central oversight. Emily consolidated it. She negotiated directly with the primary supplier, 2 hours 18 months of invoices, a detailed comparison of unit costs across all 3 vendors, and reduced the quarterly supply cost by an amount that should have made someone ask questions. Nobody asked questions. Nobody noticed. She noted that too. She mediated the Crawley dispute. Next, 2 tenant families, A shared irrigation channel, 3 months of escalating conflict that the estate steward had twice attempted and twice failed to resolve. Emily spent one afternoon in the Crawley kitchen with both families. A pot of tea and the particular patience of a woman who is interested in solutions rather than authority. She proposed a rotation schedule that cost neither family anything and gave both families everything they actually needed. James Crawley shook her hand when she left. "Finest woman in Yorkshire," he said. She thanked him and walked back to the estate, thinking about the accounts, because that was where the real problem was. She had known it since the 3rd week. She had known it since she pulled the October harvest records and found a figure that appeared twice under different line items, offset by a small adjustment that if you were reading quickly, if you trusted the structure, if you had no reason to look carefully, you would never catch. Emily was never reading quickly. Emily never trusted a structure she hadn't built herself. She pulled the September accounts. Same adjustment, different number. She pulled August. She sat in the estate office for 3 hours that afternoon and moved carefully through 8 months of records, and by the time the light failed, she understood the shape of what she was looking at, even if she did not yet understand its full extent. She called for candles and kept reading. Richard Hawthorne had managed Bradford Estate for 11 years. He was 58, silver-haired, with the measured dignity of a man who has occupied his position long enough to mistake authority for identity. He spoke in careful paragraphs. He deferred to Thomas with seamless efficiency. He managed the estate accounts with what appeared at a surface reading to be impeccable order. Emily had needed 9 days to understand that something was deeply wrong. She needed 6 more weeks to prove it. She read at night after the household went quiet, estate office, single candle door closed. She read before breakfast in the gray hour before the kitchen started. She developed a knowledge of Bradford Estate's finances more complete than Thomas's, more complete than Hawthorne's, because she approached the numbers without ego and without assumptions, following only what was actually there. During the day, she managed the household. During the evenings, she built her case. And she founded all of it. 3 years of systematic theft, patient and methodical and extraordinarily clever. Land lease agreements manipulated. Farm payments adjusted. Supply records falsified. Bradford land sold through third-party agents at 60% of market value, the remainder disappearing into accounts that took Emily 2 weeks to trace back to a name she was not expecting. Not a stranger, not an outside agent. Hawthorne. The total was significant. Significant enough to explain 3 years of quietly declining estate income despite adequate harvests. Significant enough that if it continued unchecked for another 2 years, Thomas Bradford would face a crisis he would not see coming until it was too late. Emily organized the evidence with the precision she applied to everything. She wrote a covering letter that was factual, neutral in tone, specific in its citations. She attached every supporting document. She went to Thomas on a Thursday afternoon in December. She placed the folder on his desk. She stood back and said, "I have found evidence of serious financial irregularities in the estate accounts. I believe they originate with Richard Hawthorne. I would ask you to review what I've compiled before drawing any conclusions." Thomas looked at the documents. Then he looked at her, and she saw it immediately. The thing that would stay with her on the road to Harrogate in Eleanor's morning room, through 45 minutes of not reading a single word of her book. That look. Not surprise, not concern, dismissal. Clean, complete, already decided. "You have been here less than a year," he said. Emily was very still. "Richard Hawthorne has managed this estate since I was 24 years old. He served my father before that." Thomas picked up the top document, read the first page, set it down. "You believe you understand the workings of this estate better than a man who has devoted more than a decade of his life to it." "I believe the documents speak for themselves." She kept her voice level. "I would ask only that you have them reviewed by an independent party. A solicitor. You are asking me to commission an external investigation of my own steward based on accounts assembled by my wife of 11 months. "Yes." The word sat in the room. Thomas stood. He was taller than her most people were, but Emily had spent her life understanding that height was not the same as authority, and she did not step back. "You have overstepped," he said. Possibly. She did not look away. But I would rather overstep than stay silent while your estate is taken apart from the inside. Emily. It was the first time he had used her given name without formality, and despite everything, despite the coldness, the dismissal. 11 months of being looked through, the sound of it did something small and involuntary to her chest. She ignored it. "You will not raise this matter again," he said. "You will not approach Hawthorne. You will not discuss this with any member of the staff. The management of Bradford Estate is not your concern." The fire crackled. Emily looked at Thomas Bradford, at the set of his jaw, at the distance in his eyes, at the careful, terrible architecture of a man who had built his entire self around the conviction that trusting people was the most dangerous thing in the world, and she felt for the first time since arriving something close to despair. Not for herself, for him, because she understood exactly what was going to happen next. Hawthorne came to her 2 days later. 3 clean knocks. Perfect timing. He entered at her acknowledgement and settled into the chair across from her without being invited, the move of a man who has decided the room already belongs to him. "Mrs. Bradford." Warm, measured, entirely reasonable. "I wonder if we might speak plainly." "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne." He folded his hands in his lap. "You have been reviewing the estate accounts." "I have." "And you presented some concerns to Mr. Bradford." "I did." "May I offer some advice?" His voice carried the particular warmth of a man who has practiced concern until it sounds authentic. Mr. Bradford values consistency. He values the established workings of a household that has functioned well for a very long time. What he does not value is disruption. "I see. You are young. You are new here. The accounts you reviewed are complex. They reflect arrangements extending back years, some decades. To read them in isolation without the full context..." He shook his head gently. "Mistakes are very easy to make." Emily studied him. He was extraordinary. She would give him that. The warmth, the careful concern, the subtle framing of her accuracy, as her ignorance, if she had been less observant, it might have worked. "Thank you for your candor," she said pleasantly. "I appreciate the context." He rose satisfied, gave her the nod of a man who believes he has concluded a negotiation successfully. "My door is always open, Mrs. Bradford." He left. Emily sat very still for a long time after he was gone. Then she went back to the accounts. Because Hawthorne's visit had told her something he had not intended to tell her, he was afraid. Not of Thomas. Not of the solicitor she had suggested. Of her. Of the specific, careful, unhurried way she read things. Men like Hawthorne were only afraid of people who could actually stop them. She kept reading. What happened over the next 3 weeks happened. The way inevitable things happen, not in a single moment, but through a slow accumulation of small shifts that meant very little separately and everything together. Hawthorne spoke to Thomas. She did not know exactly what he said. She did not need to. She understood the shape of it from the way Thomas looked at her across the dinner table. Not the previous looking through, but something more deliberate. The way a man looks at something he has been warned about. The household staff became careful, not unkind. Margaret remained fiercely, stubbornly loyal, but careful. Thomas stopped including her in any estate discussion at all. And then on a Thursday in January, Emily found the final piece. A file in Hawthorne's cabinet, misplaced or perhaps not misplaced, perhaps left by a man who had grown too comfortable to be careful. Among the correspondence was a bill of sale for a parcel of Bradford land, completed 3 months earlier, priced at 60% of market value, signed with Thomas Bradford's signature. Except Thomas Bradford had been in Edinburgh when that document was signed. She sat with the document in her hands for a long time. She thought about going to Thomas again. She thought about the look on his face the first time. She thought about 11 months of fixed accounts and resolved disputes and tenant families who had firewood for the winter, and a man who had looked straight through every last bit of it. She put the document in her notebook. She went to the guest room. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she made the decision not out of anger, not out of defeat, but out of the exhausted clarity that comes when you have finally fully accepted what you are actually looking at. She could not save Bradford Estate without Thomas Bradford's trust. Thomas Bradford would not give her his trust. She would leave. She told him on a Friday morning. She walked into the estate office with her case already at her side, looked at the man behind the desk, the man who had prepared her dismissal documents 3 days before she asked to go, and said, "I am leaving, Mr. Bradford." He reached into the drawer. The document was already there, already sealed. He had known. She looked at that sealed document and understood something she would carry with her all the way to Harrogate. Thomas Bradford had not dismissed her because he believed Hawthorne over her. He had dismissed her because believing her would have required him to trust someone. And trusting someone was the one thing Thomas Bradford had spent 35 years learning never to do. She looked at him one last time. She said the only true thing left to say. And then she walked out of Bradford Estate with empty hands. What she did not know, sitting in that cold carriage watching Yorkshire move past rain-cleared windows, was that she had also walked out carrying the entire case against Gerald Stanhope and Richard Hawthorne. In her notebooks, in her memory, in the careful, precise, unhurried work of a woman who had spent 11 months doing essential things in the dark. She had left with empty hands. But the truth she carried was worth more than everything she left behind. And the truth, unlike Emily, was not willing to leave quietly. The truth did not wait long. It began the morning after Emily left, though Thomas Bradford did not recognize it as the beginning of anything. He recognized it only as a Tuesday gray, functional, unremarkable, and he moved through it the way he moved through most mornings, with efficiency and without sentiment. He reviewed correspondence at 7. He met with the groundskeeper at 8. He took breakfast alone, which was not new, and found the dining room slightly colder than usual, which he attributed to the weather, and not to the absence of the woman who had for 11 months quietly ensured that the household fires were properly maintained before the family rose. He did not think about Emily. He told himself this firmly, in the particular way men tell themselves things they are not yet ready to examine as a matter settled. A chapter closed. A line drawn beneath a figure at the bottom of a ledger page. He thought about her 12 times before noon. He counted because counting things was what Thomas Bradford did when he could not control them. He counted the times her name surfaced in his thoughts, attached to nothing. Just the name rising up clean and uninvited, and he filed each one away like a minor expense he intended to stop incurring. At 10:30, Mrs. Colton came to him. The housekeeper stood in the doorway of the estate office, with her hands folded and her expression arranged into the careful neutrality of a woman who had something to say and was weighing the wisdom of saying it. "Mr. Bradford." Thomas looked up from his desk. "What is it?" "The kitchen delivery, sir. The weekly provisions from Hargrove's. They've arrived short again." Thomas set down his pen. "Short. The flour, the salt pork, and the candle wax. 3rd week in a row." A pause. "Mrs. Bradford used to handle the Hargrove account directly. There was an arrangement she had negotiated. I'm not entirely certain of the details." Thomas looked at Mrs. Colton. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who was not technically saying anything critical and who would deny doing so if asked. "Find the relevant correspondence and bring it to me," Thomas said. "I'll review it myself." Mrs. Colton's expression shifted by precisely nothing. "Of course, sir." She left. Thomas returned to his desk. He picked up his pen. He set it down again. Had not it occurred to him now, asked Emily, anything about the household supply arrangements? He had not asked her about much of anything if he was being precise about it. He had assumed reasonably he still believed that a capable household manager would manage the household, and that the proof of competent management was the absence of visible problems. There had been an absence of visible problems for 11 months. He had attributed this to the natural order of a well-run estate. He had not considered the possibility that visible problems had been actively prevented by someone working very hard to prevent them. He pushed the thought away. He went back to his correspondence. Richard Hawthorne appeared at 11. He came in with his characteristic knock and his characteristic measured dignity, and he settled into the chair across from Thomas's desk with the ease of a man who had occupied that chair for 11 years and thought of it in some private corner of himself as his. "Good morning." Hawthorne arranged his papers on his knee. I thought we might review the quarterly tenant rents. There are 1 or 2 adjustments I'd like to propose. Before that, Thomas folded his hands on the desk. The Hargrove supply account. Mrs. Colton's me, deliveries have been short 3 weeks running. What do you know about it? Hawthorne did not hesitate. He very rarely hesitated. Hargrove's has been inconsistent of late. I've been in contact with them. I expect it to resolve. There was an arrangement, something Mrs. Bradford had negotiated. A small pause. Just small enough to be invisible to someone not looking for it. I believe she did correspond with them at some point, Hawthorne acknowledged. I'm not certain the arrangement was formally documented. It may have been a personal understanding, the kind of thing that doesn't necessarily survive a change in household management. Thomas looked at him. Hawthorne returned the look with the perfect practiced openness of a man who has learned to make transparency feel like a costume. I'll look into Hargrove's directly, Thomas said. Of course, I'd be happy to handle that on your behalf. I'll handle it myself. Another small pause. Of course, Hawthorne said again, and rearranged his papers and moved on to the tenant rents. Thomas listened. He reviewed. He approved 2 of the proposed adjustments and deferred a 3rd. After Hawthorne left, he sat alone in the estate office for a while. The Hargrove arrangement, it turned out, was documented. He found the correspondence himself in the 3rd drawer of the secondary filing cabinet, a place he had not opened in several months, in a folder labeled in Emily's precise handwriting, Supply Accounts Active Negotiations. He pulled the folder. He read for 20 minutes. What Emily had done was not complicated. It was, in fact, elegantly simple. She had identified that Bradford Estate was being overcharged across 5 separate supply accounts due to overlapping vendor arrangements that nobody had ever consolidated because nobody had ever sat down and looked at all 5 accounts at the same time. She had done exactly that. She had then written to each vendor individually, made the case for a consolidated arrangement, and negotiated new terms that saved the estate a meaningful sum per quarter. The Hargrove letter was the 5th and most recent. It was dated 8 weeks ago. Thomas read it twice. Then he read Emily's covering note, which she had clipped to the front of the folder. The note was brief. It explained what she had done and why. It was written in the tone of someone reporting a completed task to a supervisor who had not in fact assigned the task, matter-of-fact informative, lacking either pride or apology. At the bottom, in slightly smaller letters, she had added, I recognize this fell outside my direct household responsibilities. If you would prefer I not engage in this kind of review going forward, please let me know, and I will confine myself to the domestic accounts. Thomas did not remember receiving this note. He searched his memory with the specific unease of a man who is starting to suspect that his memory may not be his most reliable current asset. He did not remember receiving it. He suspected he had received it, placed it in the pile of household correspondence. He reviewed infrequently and not gotten back to it. He put the folder down. He picked up his pen. He did not write anything. 3 days after Emily left, Thomas received a letter from the Crawley family. It was written by the eldest son, James Crawley, in the careful hand of a man who did not write letters often, but had decided this one was necessary. It expressed with the directness that Thomas found both unexpected and oddly difficult to dismiss the family's deep gratitude for the resolution of the irrigation dispute. The letter thanked Thomas Bradford, but the second paragraph made clear that it was not precisely Thomas Bradford who had resolved anything. Your wife came to us in October. The letter read, and sat at our table for 4 hours and listened to both sides of the argument with a patience and a fairness that I have not often seen in anyone, let alone in a person of her station. She found a solution that neither family had been able to find in 3 months of dispute because she looked for one honestly, without favoring either side, and without any interest in the outcome, except that it be right. I don't know what the custom is in your household, sir, but I would ask you to tell her from us that the Crawley family will not forget what she did, and that if there is ever any way we can return the kindness, we hope you will let us know. Thomas read the letter once. He folded it. He put it in the desk drawer. He went to find Hawthorne. The Crawley dispute, Thomas said, standing in the doorway of Hawthorne's office. "You submitted it twice for resolution without result. How did it finally get resolved?" Hawthorne looked up from his desk. His expression registered a version of mild surprise that Thomas, standing there in the doorway with James Crawley's letter in his pocket, was now examining with a precision he had not previously applied to Hawthorne's expressions. "I believe it resolved itself," Hawthorne said. "These things often do given time. I have a letter from James Crawley suggesting otherwise." A beat. "Well?" Hawthorne set down his pen with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who is thinking very fast and showing nothing. "I may have had some communication with both parties that helped move things along. The letter credits my wife." The room was quiet. "Mrs. Bradford did pay a visit to the Crawley farm, I believe," Hawthorne said carefully. "She was very enthusiastic about the tenants. I admired the impulse, though I did gently suggest to Mr. Bradford to you that tenant management is properly the steward's domain. You told me she was overstepping. I expressed some concern, yes, that her involvement might complicate established relationships." Hawthorne's tone remained measured, reasonable, impeccably collegial. "I hope that counsel was useful." Thomas looked at him. He did not say anything. He had always thought of himself as a good reader of men. He had built his adult life on that, the conviction that he could assess a person's character and reliability with the same accuracy he applied to land valuations and harvest projections. It was one of the things he was privately most proud of, in the way private men are proud of things they would never say aloud. Standing in Hawthorne's doorway, he felt the first cold finger of doubt, not certainty, just doubt. Just the beginning of a question he had not previously thought to ask. "Thank you, Hawthorne." Thomas turned. "That will be all." He walked back down the corridor. He did not go to the estate office. He went to the secondary filing cabinet. He opened every drawer. It took him 6 days to understand what he was looking at. 6 days of reading, cross-referencing, pulling contracts from the property files and comparing them against the account records, working alone in the estate office in the evenings after the household had gone quiet. He was not as fast as Emily. He did not have her particular gift for pattern recognition, the instinctive ability to look at a column of numbers and sense before analysis that something was wrong. He had to work methodically, slowly, following each thread until it either resolved cleanly or terminated in a place that made no sense. Most of the threads terminated in places that made no sense. On the 6th evening, he found the land sale document. Not the one Emily had found. He had not yet learned about that one. A different one. An earlier one from 18 months prior. A parcel of Bradford land, sold at a price that was on reflection roughly 70% of what it should have sold for through an agent he did not recognize, finalized, while Thomas himself had been in London attending to a family matter. He looked at his own signature at the bottom of the document. He had not signed this document. He sat with that knowledge for a very long time. He sat with it through the evening and through the night, and by the time dawn came and the household began to stir. Downstairs, he had sat with it long enough that the shock of it had been replaced by something colder and more useful clarity. Hawthorne had been forging his signature, not once. The pattern in the accounts, which he could now see with the clarity of someone who had been staring at it for 6 days, suggested it had been happening for at least 3 years. 3 years. Emily had walked into his office 6 weeks ago with a folder of evidence, and he had looked at her face and heard not what she was telling him, but what he had already decided about who she was and what she wanted: a new wife, unfamiliar with the estate, making claims she was not qualified to make against a man he had trusted for a decade, and he had dismissed her. He sat in the estate office as the morning light came through the windows, and he thought about that moment with a new precision. She had stood very still. He remembered when he told her she had overstepped. She had not argued. She had not cried. She had met his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and something in her expression had shifted not into defeat, but into something more final than defeat. Something that looked, he understood now, like a decision. He had watched her make the decision to leave. He had watched it happen on her face, and he had not stopped it. He pressed his hands flat on the desk. I thought, what kind of man does that make me? He did not answer the question. Not yet. He confronted Hawthorne at 9 o'clock. Not in Hawthorne's office. In the estate office, Thomas's territory. Thomas's desk. Thomas standing when Hawthorne entered, so that the geometry of the room made clear from the first second that this was not a collegial conversation. Hawthorne came in with his papers and his measured dignity and stopped when he read the room. He read it very fast. Thomas now understood very good at that. "Sit down," Thomas said. Hawthorne sat. Thomas laid the land sale document on the desk between them. Then 3 more documents, account adjustments, a vendor contract, a letter to the agent whose name had taken Emily 2 weeks to trace and had taken Thomas 3 days. Hawthorne looked at the documents. His face did not change. That itself was a kind of answer. "I would like you to explain these to me," Thomas said, "in detail, beginning with the land sale from 18 months ago. Those documents reflect, that is my signature." Thomas pointed. "I did not sign that document. I was in London. You can verify the date against my travel correspondence." Silence. "I would like you to explain," Thomas said again, beginning now. What followed was not the confession of a broken man. Richard Hawthorne had not survived 11 years of patient, methodical theft by being a man who broke easily. He constructed a defense on the spot, incomplete records, misunderstandings, the complexity of long-standing estate arrangements that required a degree of discretion that had perhaps not always been sufficiently documented, and he built it with the same skill he had applied to everything else, carefully, plausibly designed to create enough doubt to make certainty feel unreasonable. But Thomas Bradford was not this morning. The man who had sat across from Emily 6 weeks ago and chosen comfortable certainty over uncomfortable truth. He was a man who had spent 6 days reading. "Stop," Thomas said. Hawthorne stopped. "I have been through the accounts." Thomas's voice was very level. "Not a summary, not an overview. I have read every line of the accounts going back 3 years. I have pulled the original contracts for every land transaction in that period. I have compared the vendor records against the ledgers." He paused. "I know what you did." Hawthorne said nothing. "What I don't know yet is the full extent of it." Thomas looked at him directly. "I am going to find out. And I am going to need you to be present to answer specific questions as the review proceeds. You will not leave this estate until that review is complete." Still nothing. "Do you understand me?" "Yes." Hawthorne's voice was very quiet. For the first time in Thomas's memory, it was just a voice not measured, not warm, not calibrated. Just a voice coming from a man who had been very comfortable for a very long time and had just run out of comfort. "I understand." Thomas stood. "You may go back to your office," Thomas said. "I'll come to you this afternoon." Hawthorne rose. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "For what it's worth," Hawthorne said. And for a moment, something crossed his face that might in a different man have been shame. "Your wife was correct. She identified it accurately. I thought—" A pause. "I thought I had managed the situation." Thomas looked at him. "You managed it well enough," Thomas said. "You told me she wanted control of the estate. I believed you." Hawthorne said nothing. "That was my failure," Thomas said. "Not hers." He turned back to the desk. Hawthorne left. Thomas sat alone in the estate office for a long time. He pulled Emily's summary from the file where he had placed it 6 weeks ago, still in the folder, still clipped to her covering note. He read it now, the way he had not read it then, all the way through, carefully following her reasoning, checking her citations against the documents now spread across his desk. She had been right about all of it. She had been right about all of it 6 weeks ago, and he had looked at her face and decided she was wrong, and she had known he had decided that he could see it now in the restraint of her response, in the deliberate precision of her language, and she had kept her composure with the specific dignity of a person who has been disbelieved for reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of their evidence. Because she was his wife. Because she had been there less than a year. because trusting her would have required him to trust someone, which was not something Thomas Bradford had done since he was 19 years old, and had learned in the way young men sometimes learn things exactly how much that cost. He set the papers down. He thought about the morning she had walked into this office with her travel case. He thought about what she had said at the door. "I wanted the man I believed existed beneath all of it. I was wrong about him, but I was not wrong to look." He turned the sentence over in his mind. He had told himself for the 6 weeks since she left that she had meant it as a wound, a parting blow the kind women delivered when they wanted to be sure they left a mark. He had categorized it that way because categorizing things was what he did, and the category of parting blow was manageable. Finite. Something he could close a drawer on. But sitting here now with her evidence spread before him, and 3 years of systematic theft mapped in Hawthorne's handwriting. Across a dozen documents, he understood that she had not meant it as a wound at all. She had meant it as a fact. She had looked at him, really looked at him with those steady, precise, infuriating eyes, and she had seen something she believed in, and she had said so, and then she had walked out. Not in anger, in honesty. And he had stood in this room and told himself she had nothing to say worth hearing. Mrs. Colton appeared in the doorway. Thomas looked up. The housekeeper's expression had abandoned its professional neutrality. She was looking at him with the particular expression of a senior servant who has watched something go very wrong and has been waiting with diminishing patience for the person responsible to catch up. "Is there something you need, Mrs. Colton? I wanted to ask, sir, whether you have a forwarding address for Mrs. Bradford." Thomas was still. "There are several household matters that require her input." Mrs. Colton continued in the tone of someone being technically accurate and completely insincere simultaneously. "The East Wing inventory, the spring planting schedule for the kitchen garden, the Crawley winter allotment. She left instructions for Mr. Davies, but he's not been able to locate the relevant order in the September accounts, and the family will be needing the firewood before December." Thomas looked at her. Mrs. Colton looked back. "She thought of that," Thomas said. "Before she left. She thought of the Crawley family's firewood." "She thought of most things, sir." Mrs. Colton's voice was perfectly even. "Before she left." Thomas turned back to the desk. "She's in Harrogate, with her cousin Eleanor. I don't have the specific address, but a letter to Eleanor Winthrop Harrogate should reach her." Mrs. Colton gave a small nod. "Thank you, sir." She turned to go. "Mrs. Colton?" She stopped. Thomas hesitated. He was not by nature or by habit a man who made admissions. He had spent his adult life constructing a version of himself that did not require them. "She managed this household well," he said. "Better than well." Mrs. Colton turned back. She looked at him with the full, uncalibrated weight of a woman who has served a household for 20 years and has seen a great deal and has very strong opinions about most of it. "Yes," Mrs. Colton said. "She did." She left. Thomas sat with that for a while. Then he picked up a pen and pulled a sheet of paper toward him and started to write a letter. He stopped twice. He threw away the first attempt. The second attempt got further, but collapsed in the third paragraph under the weight of what he was trying to say, and his complete inability to say it in any register that did not sound like a business communication. He put the pen down. He stood. He walked to the window. Outside the estate was doing what estates did in January, operating, continuing, persisting. The groundskeeper was visible in the distance moving along the east wall. Smoke rose from the tenant cottages. The fields were bare but not barren. The autumn planting Emily had quietly reorganized after reviewing 3 years of yield records had gone into the ground before the first frost, and the groundskeeper had told Thomas with a faint air of someone reporting something he did not fully understand, that the pattern looked different this year, in a way that he thought come spring was probably going to be good. Thomas looked at all of it. He thought she spent 11 months saving this place. She saved it quietly without asking for anything, fixing problems that had accumulated for years before she arrived. Problems that were not her fault and not her responsibility. Problems that nobody had asked her to fix. And she had walked out that door with one case. He had made her walk out with one case. He pressed his forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. There were things a man could lose in his life that money could replace. He understood that now in a way he had not understood it that morning 6 weeks ago, standing behind his desk with the Bradford crest on his documents and the quiet conviction that his fortune made him safe. He had been wrong. Not just about Hawthorne, not just about the accounts, about what safety actually meant. He turned from the window. He went to the desk. He picked up the pen again, and this time he did not stop. He wrote for a long time. When he finished, he read it back once, and it was not elegant, and it was not the kind of letter that Thomas Bradford was supposed to write, and he folded it anyway and sealed it, and gave it to the footman with instructions to have it posted immediately to Eleanor Winthrop Harrogate. Then he went to find the solicitor, because there was still Hawthorne to deal with, and there was still the estate to repair. And there was still, though, he had not yet allowed himself to think about this directly, not in terms specific enough to be called hope. The possibility that Emily Winthrop was the kind of woman who could read a letter written by a man who had no talent for letters and understand what he meant, despite everything he failed to say. He thought she might be. She had always been better at reading things than he was. In Harrogate, 40 miles away, Emily was sitting in her cousin Eleanor's morning room with a cup of tea she had not touched and a book open on her lap to a page she had not read. Eleanor, who was 31 and practical, and had the specific, unsentimental kindness of a woman who had been through her own version of difficult things, set down her embroidery and said, "You're thinking about him." "I'm reading," Emily said. "You've been on the same page for 40 minutes. Emily closed the book. "I keep thinking about the accounts," she said. "The Eastfield land sale. The document Hawthorne had, Thomas signed the one with the forged date. If Thomas doesn't find it himself, the next stage of transfers will go through before spring, and by then, Emily, by then the damage will be significantly harder to reverse. The eastern parcels are the most productive land on the estate. If those are undersold, Emily." Eleanor's voice was gentle and firm in equal measure. "You left." "I know I left." "You left because he didn't listen to you." "I know." "So why are you sitting in my morning room worrying about land? He told you wasn't your concern." Emily was quiet. She looked at the unread page of her book. "Because it was never really about the land," she said finally. Eleanor looked at her cousin, the careful set of her shoulders, the precision of her stillness, the particular quality of pain in someone who has decided to be sensible about something they feel deeply and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she picked up her embroidery again. "He'll either find it himself," Eleanor said, "or he won't. I know. And if he doesn't, I know. There's nothing you can do about it from here." Emily looked at the window, at the Harrogate sky, which was gray and cold, and nothing at all like the Bradford estate sky, which was also gray and cold, but somehow in her memory carried a different quality, as though the specific weight of those clouds meant something she was not yet prepared to let go of. "No," she said quietly. "There isn't." She picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. She was not a woman who wasted things, and somewhere in the back of her mind, patient and uninvited and stubbornly persistent as the truth she had left behind in that estate office, she wondered whether Thomas Bradford, alone in that room, with all her evidence finally laid out before him, was finding what she had found. She wondered whether he was capable of it. She had believed once that he was. She was not yet willing to say she had been wrong. The letter arrived in Harrogate on a Thursday. Emily knew it was from Thomas before she opened it. She recognized the handwriting on the outside, precise, slightly compressed, the hand of a man who had been taught penmanship as a discipline rather than an art. She had seen that handwriting on 100 documents at Bradford Estate. She had filed letters written in that hand, cross-referenced them against account records, matched them to dates and transactions, and the long, careful archaeology of a marriage she was still trying to understand. She held the letter for a full minute before she broke the seal. Eleanor, to her credit, found somewhere else to be. The letter was 3 pages. It was not eloquent. Thomas Bradford was many things, and Eleanor had been right that Emily was thinking about him, had been thinking about him with the same involuntary persistence she had spent 11 months applying to his accounts, but eloquent was not among his qualities, and the letter showed it. He wrote the way he did everything directly without ornament, as though sentiment were a kind of inefficiency he did not have time for. He had found the accounts he wrote. He had found the land sale documents. He had found the agent's correspondence. He had confronted Hawthorne. A solicitor had been engaged. The matter was now in formal legal process. He had been wrong to dismiss her evidence. He wrote that plainly without qualification or mitigation. I was wrong to dismiss what you brought to me. The evidence was sound. Your assessment was correct. I did not consider it properly, and the consequences of that failure are mine to address. Emily read that sentence twice. Then she read the next paragraph, which was shorter and harder, and clearly cost him something to write. I am also aware that my error was not only professional. You came to me with something that required trust, and I refused to give it. I have spent some time examining why I made that choice, and I am not satisfied with my conclusions. I do not expect you to find this letter sufficient. I am writing it because I owe you at minimum the acknowledgement that you were right and I was not. And because there are matters at Bradford Estate that require decisions, I am not certain I can make correctly without your knowledge of the accounts. Emily put the letter in her lap. She looked at the wall of Eleanor's morning room. She thought he is asking me to come back as an account manager. Then she read the final paragraph. That is not the only reason I am writing, but it is the reason I am able to put into words. The other reasons are present but not yet organized. I recognize that is inadequate. I am working on it. She sat with that for a very long time. Eleanor appeared in the doorway eventually, with the timing of a woman who had been listening for the sound of pages folding. Well, Emily folded the letter carefully. He found Hawthorne. And he says he was wrong. Eleanor came in and sat across from her. She studied Emily's face with the attention of someone who knew that face very well, and was reading it the way Emily read ledgers, following what was actually there, rather than what she wished for. What are you going to do? Emily was quiet. He says there are matters requiring my knowledge of the accounts, she said finally. He's not wrong about that. If the solicitor is reviewing the land sales, they'll need to cross-reference against the October harvest records and the vendor correspondence I filed. There are things I know about those documents that aren't obvious on a first reading. Eleanor looked at her. Emily. What? That is not why you're considering going back. A pause. No, Emily said. It isn't. She put the letter in her pocket. She did not say anything else. But the next morning, she asked Eleanor's footman to inquire about the coach schedule to Bradford. She did not write back first. That was a decision she made deliberately, and she understood exactly what it meant. If she wrote back, and he replied, and they negotiated the terms of her return through letters, the whole thing would become a transaction. Polite. Managed. Conducted at the safe distance that Thomas Bradford preferred for everything that mattered. She had spent 11 months at that distance. She was not going back there. So she came in person, arriving at Bradford Estate on a Tuesday morning, 4 weeks after she had left in another hired coach in weather that was cold but dry, which she did not take as a sign of anything, because she had stopped reading circumstances for omens somewhere around the 3rd month of her marriage. The coach stopped at the main entrance. Thomas was not there. Mrs. Colton was. The housekeeper stood on the front steps, with her hands folded, and her expression carrying for the first time since Emily had known her, something openly readable relief. Mrs. Bradford. Mrs. Colton came forward and took Emily's case before Emily could pick it up herself. We weren't expecting you until Thursday. The Tuesday coach was faster. Mr. Bradford is in the estate office. He's been there since 6 this morning. Mrs. Colton guided her inside with the efficiency of a woman who has waited 4 weeks for this moment and intends to make the most of it. He's been there most mornings since you left, truth be told. The solicitor comes every other day. There are papers everywhere. Emily paused in the entrance hall. Has he eaten? Mrs. Colton stopped. She turned. She looked at Emily with an expression that contained in compressed form everything she had been professionally prohibited from saying for 4 weeks. No, she said. He has not. Emily handed her coat to the footman. I'll see to it. She walked to the estate office. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting. Thomas was at the desk. He was surrounded by papers, the solicitor's documents clearly along with the account files Emily recognized, and several new folders she did not. He looked up when she came in, and the expression that crossed his face happened too fast for him to manage it. Surprise, something complicated and abrupt, and then the familiar careful rearrangement. But she had seen the first thing, the unmanaged thing, and it told her something she filed away without comment. "You came," he said. "You wrote." She looked at the desk. "Have you eaten today?" He looked briefly as though the question were in a foreign language. I'll have Mrs. Colton send something." Emily pulled the chair from the far side of the room to the desk and sat across from him. "Show me where the solicitor's review stands." Thomas looked at her for a moment. Just a moment, the specific look of a man recalibrating rapidly, and then he turned the desk toward her and began to explain. They worked for 3 hours. It was not like the 11 months before. It was different in ways that were hard to name, but impossible to miss. Thomas did not look through her. He did not rephrase her observations as his own conclusions. When she identified something in the accounts and explained her reasoning, he listened. Actually listened, the way she had spent 11 months hoping he would, and when he did not follow her logic, he said so directly rather than dismissing it. Small things. The kind of things that shouldn't have made a difference. They made a difference. At one point, she reached across the desk to pull a document from the wrong pile, and her hand crossed his briefly, neither of them moving for a half second before she retrieved the document, and they both returned to the numbers. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them needed to. The solicitor arrived at noon. His name was Mr. Alderton, a compact, careful man of about 50 who had been the Bradford family's legal representative for 12 years, and who looked at Emily when Thomas introduced her as Mrs. Bradford, with the focused attention of someone who has been hearing a great deal about a specific person and is now meeting them for the first time. "Mrs. Bradford." Alderton shook her hand with the directness of a man who respects competence wherever he finds it. "Mr. Bradford tells me you were the first to identify the irregularities." "I found the initial evidence, yes. The land sale document, the forged signature from 18 months ago. Were you aware there were others?" Emily was still. She looked at Thomas. Thomas met her eyes. Something passed between them. Not quite guilt, not quite apology, but the specific look of a man who has continued to discover how badly he miscalculated and has stopped being surprised by each new discovery. "I was not," Emily said carefully. "I found one document before I left." "How many are there?" Alderton opened his folder. "We have identified at present 6 land transactions bearing signatures we believe to have been forged. The earliest dates to approximately 3.5 years ago. The total value of land transferred below market represents a significant portion of the Bradford estate." The room was very quiet. 3.5 years, Emily said. Yes. She did the arithmetic quickly, the way she did everything quickly, and the number she arrived at was considerably larger than the number she had estimated 6 weeks ago when she had first assembled her evidence. Larger than she had realized. Larger than if Hawthorne had simply been given more time, Bradford Estate could have recovered from without serious difficulty. "He started before Thomas's father died," she said. Alderton looked at her. "That is our current assessment, yes." The implication of that settled over the room like weather. Hawthorne had not started stealing from Thomas Bradford. He had started stealing from Thomas Bradford's father, from an older man, perhaps more trusting, perhaps less observant, who had given a long-serving steward the kind of authority that comes with decades of apparent loyalty, and that authority had been the beginning of it. Thomas had inherited not just the estate, but the theft that was already embedded in it. Emily looked at Thomas. He was very still. His face had the particular quality it got when something had hit him harder than he intended to show, that controlled, compressed stillness that she had once mistaken for indifference and now understood was the opposite. "Thomas." She said his name quietly, and he looked at her, and she said, "This is not your failure. This started before you had any reason to look." He held her gaze. "I had reason to look 6 weeks ago," he said. She did not argue with that. because it was true, and they both knew it, and the kind of honesty that was beginning to exist between them in this room was not the kind that needed softening. "Yes," she said. "You did." Alderton looked between them with the practiced discretion of a lawyer who has learned that some of the most important conversations in an estate happen between the people who live in it, and that the best thing he can do during those conversations is review his notes. He reviewed his notes. The full picture of what Hawthorne had done took 3 more days to map completely. Emily worked alongside Alderton and Thomas, and the picture that emerged was more intricate than she had originally understood. Not just the land sales, not just the supply account manipulations, but a layered structure of small diversions that individually could each be explained away as clerical error, but together formed a pattern of deliberate long-term extraction that was almost elegant in its construction. Hawthorne had been very good. She said this aloud on the second evening when the 3 of them had been sitting with documents for 6 hours, and the candles were burning low, and Thomas had finally at her insistence asked the kitchen to send a proper supper. "He was very good," she said. "Remarkably so. This wasn't improvised. He planned it over years." Alderton agreed. Thomas said nothing. Emily looked at a vendor contract and turned it 45 degrees to read a notation in the margin. He used the estate's own complexity against it. Large estates with multiple income streams are difficult to audit precisely because there are so many moving parts. He created deliberate overlap between accounts that made cross-referencing painful enough that nobody did it. "Nobody until you," Alderton said. "I came in without existing assumptions," Emily said. "I didn't know which accounts were supposed to balance which way. I only knew what the numbers actually said." Thomas was looking at her. She could feel it without meeting his eyes. "That's what I missed," Thomas said. The words came out quiet, almost as though he were thinking aloud rather than speaking to the room. "I trusted the structure. I trusted the categories. I believed the accounts looked right because Hawthorne had built them to look right, and I never questioned the framework he'd built because I'd inherited it along with everything else." "Most people would have made the same mistake," Alderton offered. Thomas looked at the window. She didn't. The word landed in the room. Emily kept her eyes on the vendor contract. Hawthorne had been removed from the estate the morning after Thomas confronted him. He had left quietly, which was somehow the most appropriate exit for a man who had spent 11 years being quiet about things that mattered. He was currently staying at an inn in the village, under the understanding that he was available to answer questions from Alderton's office, and was not to leave the county. Emily had not seen him. She had, however, found something in his vacated office that she had not expected. She found it on her second day back when she went to Hawthorne's filing system to locate a set of records Alderton needed. She was working through the 3rd drawer when she pulled out a folder that was labeled in Hawthorne's precise hand, "Bradford Personal Correspondence." She should have put it back. She knew she should have put it back. She read the top letter, which was addressed to Hawthorne from someone she did not know, and then she read the second letter, and by the third, she was sitting on the floor of Hawthorne's office, with the folder in her lap, reading with the focused stillness of someone who has just discovered that the map they've been using is missing an entire continent. She went to Thomas. "How was in the estate office?" It was late afternoon, and the light was going, and he was working by the fire because the candles had not yet been brought. "I found something," she said. He looked up. She handed him the folder. He opened it. She watched his face. He read the first letter. His expression did not change. He read the second letter. Still nothing, but his jaw tightened by the precise amount that in Thomas Bradford's vocabulary of controlled responses amounted to significant disturbance. He read the third letter. He set the folder down very carefully on the desk. "Where did you find this?" "Hawthorne's filing cabinet, 3rd drawer. It was filed under your name." Thomas looked at the folder. Emily waited. The letters were from Hawthorne to a man named Gerald Stanhope, a name Emily had recognized on the 3rd reading because Stanhope was the name of the agent through whom the forged land sales had been processed. But the letters were not about land sales. They were about Thomas Bradford himself. They were specifically about Thomas Bradford's father, and what the letters contained. What they had contained for 3 years, filed neatly in Hawthorne's cabinet under the heading of Thomas's name, kept where only Hawthorne could access them, was information about the final months of the elder Bradford's life. Information that contradicted quietly, and with specific documentary detail, the version of events that Thomas had been told. The elder Bradford had not, as Thomas had believed, made the decision to trust Hawthorne completely in his final year, due to declining health and simplified priorities. He had made it because Hawthorne had shown him letters, fabricated letters. Emily now understood cross-referencing the paper and the handwriting against everything else in the folder letters, suggesting that certain family members and associates were seeking to leverage the estate against the elder Bradford's wishes. Hawthorne had isolated the elder Bradford from the people most likely to notice what was happening, and Thomas had been one of those people. At 24 years old, Thomas Bradford had been systematically kept at arm's length from his own father's affairs by a man who had constructed letter by letter the impression that the distance was warranted, that there were reasons for it, that his father's withdrawal was a choice rather than a manipulation. Thomas sat very still. The fire crackled. Emily did not speak. She understood that there were moments that required silence, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of witness, of simply being present while someone sits with something that changes the shape of a thing they thought they understood. She had learned to recognize this kind of silence at Bradford Estate. She had had practice. After a long time, Thomas put his hand flat on the folder. "He took everything," Thomas said. Not loud, not angry. Just a statement flat and accurate with the weight of a man who has finally counted the full cost of a theft that was much larger than he thought. "Yes," Emily said. "My father spent his last 2 years." He stopped. He looked at the fire. "My father died thinking I had chosen to keep my distance. He died believing I didn't." He stopped again. Emily crossed the room. She did not touch him. She was not certain in that moment that touching him was what the moment required. She stood beside the desk close enough that he was not alone in the room with it, and she let him have the silence for as long as he needed. It took a while. When he looked up, his face was the most open she had ever seen it. Not broken. Thomas Bradford was not a man who broke, but stripped of the particular armor he wore so constantly. She had come to think of it as his actual face. Underneath it was someone much younger, and much more frightened, and much more human. "He died thinking it was my choice," Thomas said. "You didn't know," Emily said. "I should have. You were 24 years old, and someone you trusted was lying to you with documentation." Her voice was firm, not harsh, just clear the way she was clear about things that mattered. "You couldn't have known." Thomas looked at her. "You keep doing that," he said. "What?" "Defending me." Something crossed his face. "I don't understand why." Emily held his gaze. "Because the truth deserves to be accurate," she said. "In both directions. You made real mistakes. Mistakes I won't pretend didn't happen. But Hawthorne's crimes are Hawthorne's, not yours. Your father's last years are his crime, not yours." Thomas looked at the folder. "And the 6 weeks ago," his voice was quiet, "when you brought me evidence and I told you you'd overstepped, that one's yours," she said. A beat. The ghost of something, not quite a smile, but the shape of one, crossed his face, gone almost before it arrived. "Yes," he said, "it is." Alderton came the following morning with news that changed the shape of everything again. He arrived at 8 o'clock, which was early for a solicitor's visit, and the earliness told Thomas what the news was going to be before Alderton spoke. "Stanhope," Alderton said, settling his folder on the desk. "Gerald Stanhope. We've been looking into his involvement in the land transactions." He glanced at Emily, who was seated to Thomas's right, and then at Thomas, who nodded. "Stanhope is not simply an agent who processed these transactions." "What is he?" Thomas said. "Hi, as a partner." Alderton laid a document on the desk. "A silent partner structured through a private arrangement that predates even Hawthorne's involvement in the estate. He appears, based on our current research, to have been the original architect of the arrangement." The room was very still. "Hawthorne was working for someone," Emily said. "It appears so." Alderton's voice was careful and even. "And Stanhope has continued connections to 2 other estates in Yorkshire, estates where we are now seeing similar patterns in the account records. Thomas looked at this document. His face had gone very still. "He does this professionally," Thomas said. "That is what we believe, yes." Alderton folded his hands. "Which means that what happened here at Bradford Estate was not opportunistic. It was targeted. Your estate was identified likely because of the complexity of the income streams, the lack of centralized accounting oversight, and the availability of a steward willing to cooperate, and the extraction was planned and executed over a period of years." Emily thought about her first week at Bradford Estate. The overlapping supply accounts, the inconsistent harvest records, the patterns that had required her to look sideways at the numbers before she could see what they were telling her. She thought about all the things she had been able to see only because she had no prior assumptions about what she was supposed to find. She thought about Thomas telling her she had been there less than a year. "They needed the estate to have no one looking carefully at the books," she said slowly. "No one without existing assumptions. No one who would approach the accounts as a fresh document rather than a familiar one." "Precisely," Alderton said. "And the best protection against that kind of scrutiny," she continued, "is an estate owner who believes the accounts are already managed by people he trusts and who has no reason to introduce an independent review." She looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at her. The thing that passed between them in that moment was complicated. It was not accusation, and it was not absolution. It was something more honest than both the specific recognition between two people who have looked at the same truth from different angles and arrived finally at the same place. "They counted on you dismissing me," she said quietly. "Not an accusation, a fact." "Yes," Thomas said. "Just that. Just the word direct and undefended. And Hawthorne helped that along." "He knew," Thomas said. "From the first week you were here. He knew you were looking at the accounts. He told me you wanted control of the estate. Thomas stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the desk. "He gave me exactly what I was already inclined to believe. That a woman of less than 12 months in this house couldn't be trusted over a man of 11 years. Alderton was doing something very attentive with his papers. "I was inclined to believe it," Thomas said. "That is the part I keep coming back to. He didn't have to work very hard." Emily said nothing, because there was nothing to say about that hadn't already been said, and the thing she respected most about Thomas Bradford in this moment, the thing she had always believed was in him, beneath the armor and the distance, and the careful architecture of a man who had been taught that trusting people cost too much, was that he was looking at his own failure directly. Not mitigating it, not explaining it into something more comfortable, just looking. It was the hardest thing a person could do. She knew because she had done her own version of it on the road to Harrogate in a cold hired carriage, examining the ways she had hoped past evidence, believed past doubt, stayed past the point where staying made sense. They had both made their mistakes. The question now was what came next. Alderton left at noon. The estate was quiet in that particular way. It got in the early afternoon the household tasks of morning, completed the evening work not yet begun, a held-breath quality to the air. Thomas found Emily in the morning room. She was at the writing table working through a set of account summaries she had asked Alderton to leave with her. She did not look up immediately when he came in. She was mid-figure, and she always finished what she was doing before she looked up, which was a habit he had initially found irritating, and had somewhere along the 11 months stopped finding irritating without entirely noticing when the shift happened. "The Eastfield parcels," she said, still writing. "The first 2 sales are recoverable. The land wasn't formally registered under the new owners. Hawthorne processed the paperwork, but didn't complete the registration, probably because he needed Thomas Bradford's physical signature on the registry documents and couldn't forge that particular form without higher risk. If Alderton moves quickly, those 2 parcels can be reclaimed through the county court." She looked up. Thomas was standing in the center of the room, and he was not holding any documents, and he had not come in to discuss the accounts. She set down her pen. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has prepared something and is now finding that everything he prepared feels inadequate to the actual moment. "I owe you more than a letter," he said. Emily waited. "I owe you." He stopped. Tried again. The night you brought me the evidence. You stood in this house and you told me what was happening to it, and I told you that you had overstepped. That you couldn't understand the estate as well as men who had served for decades. He paused. I said that because I was afraid. She had not expected that word. She was quiet, and she kept her face as steady as she could, because she understood that this was hard for him, and that the worst thing she could do right now was react too quickly. Afraid of what? She said carefully. Thomas crossed to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment. Not evasively, she thought, but in the way of someone who finds it easier to say true things when they are not being watched. When my father died, he said, I decided something. I decided that the only safe way to live was to keep everything at a calculable distance. Land, finances, people. He paused. I believed that if I maintained sufficient control over the measurable things, I would not be caught off guard by the unmeasurable ones. Emily said nothing. You were unmeasurable. He turned back. His face was very open. From the first week, you noticed things I hadn't told you to look for. You fixed things I didn't know were broken. You sat across from me at dinner and asked me about the tenants, and I didn't know how to answer because nobody had asked me that question before, not because nobody cared, but because I had arranged my life so carefully that caring had nowhere to enter. The room was very quiet. And then you brought me evidence, he said. Real, documented, accurate evidence that someone I had trusted for a decade was dismantling everything I thought I had protected. And I had a choice: trust you, or trust the structure I'd spent my whole life building. He looked at her directly. I chose the structure. I know, she said. It was the worst decision I have ever made. The words were simple. He meant them completely. She could see the absence of performance, the unmanaged quality of it, the rawness of a man saying something that is difficult to say to the one person it matters most to say it to. She stood. She crossed the room. She stopped 2 feet from him. Thomas. She looked up at him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. All right, Lee. All right. Why did you write to me? He held her gaze without flinching. Because the estate needed your knowledge of the accounts. And a beat, long enough to be a choice. And because the house was wrong without you in it, he said. Every room, every morning, the entire estate felt like a problem I didn't know how to solve, and I have spent my adult life solving problems, and I couldn't identify what was missing until I sat in the estate office at 6 in the morning and realized I was talking to myself about a supply account because you weren't there to talk to. She looked at him. That is not adequate, he said. I know it isn't. 11 months of... Stop. She held up her hand. Don't minimize what you're saying by qualifying it. He stopped. She took a breath. I came back, she said, because there are accounts that need managing, and because Alderton needed the documentation context. Those are the reasons I told myself. And the real reason, she looked at him steadily, because I was not ready to be finished believing in you, she said. Even after everything. That is either very foolish or very stubborn, and I am not yet certain which. Thomas looked at her. Really looked the way she had spent 11 months wanting him to, and something in his face settled not into relief, but into something quieter and more durable. The look of a man who has been holding his breath for a long time and has just remembered how to exhale. I think, he said carefully, that it might be courage. The word sat between them. Outside, the January afternoon was cold and gray and going to dark. Inside, the fire had been properly tended. Someone had remembered this morning, and the room was warm, and neither of them moved, and neither of them needed to. Not yet. The accounts were still on the writing table. Alderton was coming again in 2 days. There was Stanhope still to deal with, and the county court, and the question of the Eastfield parcels, and the long work of repairing what had been taken. All of that was still there. But right now in this room, something else was happening. Something that had been trying to happen for 11 months, through cold dinners and dismissed evidence, and a woman driving away in a hired carriage in the rain. Something patient and stubborn and unwilling to be finished. The truth Emily had thought in that carriage. The truth wasn't willing to leave quietly. She had been right about that. She just hadn't known then that she was the truth she was talking about. The work of repairing what Hawthorne had taken did not happen quickly. That was the first thing Emily understood when she came back. Not the accounts, not the legal process, not even the question of what she and Thomas were becoming to each other. The first thing she understood was that damage of this kind, damage that had been accumulating quietly for 3.5 years beneath the surface of a life that appeared intact, did not reverse itself in weeks. It reversed itself the way it had been inflicted, slowly, methodically, one document at a time. She was prepared for that. What she was less prepared for was Thomas. Not the Thomas she had married 11 months ago. The composed, controlled, efficiently distant man who had managed her like an asset class and called it a marriage. That Thomas she had understood, or at least understood well enough to navigate. She was less prepared for this. Thomas, the one who appeared in the estate office at 6 in the morning, with his collar not yet properly fastened, and his face carrying the specific rawness of a man who had not slept well and was not pretending otherwise. The one who, when she set a cup of tea on the corner of his desk without comment, looked up at her with an expression so unguarded it was almost difficult to witness. She found him there every morning. She stopped being surprised by the 3rd day. By the 5th day, she was bringing 2 cups. They did not talk about what this meant. They talked about the accounts and the solicitor's latest findings, and the tenant rents and the Eastfield parcels that Alderton was working to reclaim through the county court. They talked about Stanhope, who had retained his own legal counsel and was conducting himself with the elaborate ease of a man who believes his own documentation is better than it is. They talked about the Crawley family's firewood allotment, which had finally been located in the September accounts, exactly where Emily had told Margaret it would be, and delivered and acknowledged by James Crawley, with a letter of thanks so warm it made Mrs. Colton cry in the kitchen. They talked about everything, except the thing that sat between them, like a third presence in every room. Patient, persistent waiting. On the 7th morning, Thomas said, "You should have your rooms back." Emily looked up from the account summary she was reviewing. "My rooms. The main suite. You were moved to the guest room in—" He stopped. "Before you left, I should not have allowed that to happen." "I moved myself," Emily said. "I know." "You didn't object." "I know," he said again, and the evenness in his voice had the careful quality of a man who has examined a specific failure thoroughly and is not looking for exoneration, just accuracy. "I should have. I didn't." Emily looked at him. "Thomas, I'm currently sleeping in the guest room, and the accounts are functional, and the estate is not collapsing. Let's address matters in order of urgency." He looked at her for a moment. Then something happened in his face, not the ghost of a smile she had seen before, but an actual one, brief and unguarded, gone before she could do anything useful about it. "All right," he said. He went back to his documents. She went back to hers. But she was smiling too 3 minutes later when she turned a page, and he wasn't looking, and she did not try to stop it. Alderton arrived on Thursday with news about Stanhope, and the news was not good. Emily read it in Alderton's face before he opened his folder in the slight compression around his mouth. The careful way he set his papers down, the professional steadiness of a man who has practiced delivering unwelcome information. "Stanhope has filed a counterclaim," Alderton said. "He's asserting that the land transactions were legitimate, conducted in good faith, through a properly authorized agent, and that any irregularities in the account records are internal Bradford estate matters that do not affect the legal standing of the sales." Thomas was very still. "He's claiming Hawthorne had authorization. He's claiming the transactions bear Bradford authorization, yes. The forged signatures, combined with Hawthorne's long tenure and apparent authority, give him a framework to argue that the estate effectively ratified the arrangements." Alderton paused. "It is not a strong argument, but it is an argument, and in county court arguments can take time." "How much time?" "Months. Possibly approaching a year for the full matter." Emily was already pulling documents from the account file. "The vendor correspondence from September will help," she said. "The letters show Hawthorne negotiating terms that exceeded his documented authority. There are specific thresholds in the estate's management charter, above which any transaction required Thomas's direct signature. The land sales were all above those thresholds." Alderton looked at her. "You have the management charter. I filed it in October. It was in the secondary cabinet under estate governance. It probably hasn't been reviewed in... She glanced at Thomas. Has this document been reviewed recently? Not to my knowledge, Thomas said carefully. Then Stanhope's legal team may not know it exists. Emily set the account folder on the desk. If Hawthorne knew about it, and he must have, he would have had every reason not to mention it. It directly contradicts the authorization argument. Alderton was already writing. Thomas watched Emily from across the desk. She was moving through the documents with the focused, unhurried precision of someone doing the work. She was genuinely built for, not performing competence, not proving anything, just doing what she did with the unself-conscious fluency of real expertise. He thought about Richard Hawthorne telling him in the warm and measured voice of a trusted advisor that Emily wanted control of the estate. I thought about how readily he had believed it. He looked down at his own hands on the desk. "Get the charter," he said quietly. Emily was already at the filing cabinet. The management charter changed the shape of Stanhope's counterclaim considerably, as Alderton confirmed when he reviewed it that afternoon. It would not resolve the matter immediately. Stanhope's lawyers would pivot, find a new angle delay where they could, but it removed the central pillar of his defense and put the Bradford estate's legal position on substantially stronger ground. Alderton left at 4 o'clock, slightly more optimistic than he had arrived. Emily walked him to the door. When she returned to the estate office, Thomas was standing at the window. "He didn't know about the charter," Thomas said. "Hawthorne did," Emily said. "He knew the charter existed, and he knew it limited his authority, and he filed transactions above that limit anyway, and counted on no one reading the charter carefully enough to make the connection. Because no one had read it in years. Because no one had read it at all as far as I can tell. It was filed correctly, but never indexed. I only found it because I was going through the entire secondary cabinet systematically in my third week." She paused. "I noted it and filed a copy under estate governance because I thought it might be useful to know what authorities were formally delegated and to whom." Thomas was looking at her with that expression again, the open one, the unarmored one. "You filed it in October," he said. "Yes." 2 months before you tried to show me the evidence." "Yes." "You had already identified the charter as potentially relevant." "I didn't know yet what it was relevant to," she said. "I just knew it was important." Thomas turned fully from the window. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her close enough that the conversation became something slightly different from a conversation about documents. "Emily." She met his eyes. "I need to say something to you that is not about the accounts." Her pulse did a thing she chose not to examine too carefully. "All right," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the morning you left, about what you said at the door." He paused. "You said you were not wrong to look, for the man you believed was beneath what I showed you." "I remember. I want you to know." He stopped. He was not a man who struggled for words as a general matter, but this was clearly not a general matter. And she watched him work through it with the patience she had always had for Thomas Bradford, even when she had not wanted to. "I want you to know that the man you were looking for is aware that he was found, despite doing everything possible to prevent it." Emily was very still. "I is also aware," Thomas continued, "that the woman who looked has more reason than most to have stopped looking by now, and that she came back anyway." He held her gaze. "I don't know what to do with that. I'm not certain I've ever known what to do when someone..." He stopped again. "When someone is simply on your side." "It's unfamiliar," she offered. "Completely." "You'll learn," she said. He looked at her. The not quite smile came back, and this time it went further than it had before, and stayed longer, and she looked at it with the frank appreciation of someone who has waited a long time for a particular thing and is not going to pretend now that it's arrived that she hasn't been waiting. "I intend to," he said. The letter from Gerald Stanhope's lawyers arrived the following Monday, and it was everything Alderton had predicted. A pivot, a new framing, a set of arguments designed not so much to win as to delay and exhaust. But there was something else in the letter. Something that Alderton, when he read it, set on the desk with the deliberateness of a man handling something that requires careful treatment. "There is a name here," Alderton said. Referenced in the supporting correspondence Stanhope's team filed as part of their documentation package. He looked at Thomas. "A name connected to the original arrangement between Stanhope and Hawthorne. The arrangement that predates your tenure." Thomas leaned forward. "What name?" "A third party." Alderton's voice was measured. "Someone who introduced Stanhope to the Bradford estate as a suitable target. Someone with prior knowledge of the estate's structure, its account complexity, and—" he paused. "Its family circumstances." The room was very quiet. "Prior knowledge of family circumstances," Emily repeated slowly. "Yes." "Meaning knowledge from inside the family," Thomas said. "That is the implication." Thomas picked up the letter. He read it. His face went through several things in rapid succession. Comprehension. Then something colder. Then the very particular stillness of a man confronting a betrayal that is worse than the one he had already been processing. Emily watched him. "Who?" she said. Thomas set the letter down. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then he said a name. The name was not Hawthorne's. It was the name of Thomas's uncle, his father's younger brother. A man Thomas had seen perhaps 4 times in the last decade who lived in Edinburgh, who had contested the elder Bradford's will, mildly and unsuccessfully, and who had apparently found a more patient and more profitable alternative to litigation. Emily looked at the letter. She read the passage Alderton had indicated. The uncle had not stolen from Bradford estate directly. He had done something more elegant and more devastating. He had identified Stanhope as a professional operator, introduced him to the opportunity that Bradford estate represented, and received a quiet percentage of the proceeds in exchange for the information that made the whole arrangement possible. Family information. The elder Bradford's declining health, the complexity of the estate's accounts, the character of the steward who could be approached. The information that turned Bradford estate from a difficult target into an easy one. "Your uncle," Emily said quietly. "Yes. He knew your father was ill. He visited twice in the last year." Thomas's voice was completely level. The levelness of someone using control, the way you use a tourniquet, not from preference, but from necessity. "He knew the household. He knew Hawthorne. He would have seen the accounts. He introduced Stanhope before your father died," Emily said, following the timeline in the document, "which means Hawthorne was approached while your father was still alive but already losing capacity, before you took full control." Thomas stood. He walked to the window. Emily let him have the moment. She understood, because she had spent 11 months studying this man, reading him with the same careful precision she applied to account books, following what was actually there, rather than what she wished were true, that what he was feeling right now was not simply anger. It was grief. The specific, terrible grief of discovering that something you had already mourned was worse than you knew. His father's last 2 years. The isolation, the distance, the letters Hawthorne had fabricated. All of that had been architecture deliberate, constructed, designed by someone who had been in that house and sat at that table and called himself family. "Thomas." Her voice was quiet. He turned. His face was very open and very controlled. At the same time, the two things working against each other in a way she recognized, because she had made that same face in a cold hired carriage, driving away from everything she had built here, trying to hold herself together through pure precision, when everything she felt was the opposite of precise. She crossed the room. She did not stop at 2 feet this time. She took his hand. He looked down at their hands and then up at her face with the expression of a man for whom this particular gesture, simple, direct, offered without negotiation, is so outside his established experience of the world that he is not certain he is reading it correctly. "You are not alone in this," she said. He said nothing. "Thomas, you are not alone in this." His hand closed around hers. He looked at the window for a long moment. Outside, January was doing what January did. Cold gray, indifferent to the specific weight of what was happening inside this room. "He sat at my father's table," Thomas said. His voice was almost steady. "He sat at our table, every Christmas until I was 15. He called my father his brother. I know. And he? I know, she said again. She did not offer a word of comfort that minimized it or a perspective that made it more bearable. There was nothing to offer that was true, and also less painful, and Emily Winthrop had never been willing to choose comfort over truth. She just stood beside him, her hand in his. He held it like it was the most solid thing in the room. After a while he let out a breath long, slow, the kind that comes from very deep down in a person. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. He did not let go of her hand. She did not take it back. Alderton moved quickly, with the uncle's involvement documented in Stanhope's own, filing a miscalculation on Stanhope's part, or perhaps a deliberate attempt to spread culpability that had backfired. The legal picture shifted dramatically. The uncle's cooperation could be negotiated. He had far more to lose from a full public exposure than from a private settlement. And Alderton, who turned out to have a quietly formidable quality. Beneath his careful professional manner was very clear about the terms that would be required. The uncle agreed within a week. His agreement included a sworn statement about Stanhope's operation, how it had been structured, how many estates it had targeted, the full scope of the arrangement. It was the statement that Stanhope's lawyers had not anticipated and could not neutralize, and within 3 days of its submission to the county court, Stanhope's legal position collapsed with the specific ugly speed of a structure that has been built without a foundation. The Eastfield parcels were ordered returned to Bradford Estate. The broader financial recovery would take time, months of careful account reconstruction, vendor renegotiation, the slow work of rebuilding what had been diverted over 3.5 years. But the foundation of it was there, and it was sound, and Emily spent 3 evenings building a recovery schedule, so precise and so well documented, that Alderton told Thomas on his way out after reviewing it, that he had worked with estates for 20 years and had never seen anything quite like it. Thomas relayed this to Emily. "He's being generous," she said without looking up. "He's being accurate," Thomas said. She looked up then. He was leaning in the doorway of the estate office with his arms crossed, and his expression carrying something she was beginning to recognize as his particular version of a compliment, understated, direct, delivered without ornament, in the same way he did everything important. "It's a good schedule," she said. "It's an exceptional schedule. Thomas, Emily." She gave him a look. He gave her the not-quite smile, which was now occurring often enough that she had stopped pretending to be unaffected by it. "Fine," she said. "It's an exceptional schedule." He pushed off from the doorframe. "I know." He came in and sat across from her, and they worked until the candles burned low, and it was the best evening Emily could remember at Bradford Estate, which was a sentence she examined privately with the careful precision she applied to everything, and found to be completely true. The letter from Emily's father arrived in the 3rd week of February. It was addressed to both of them, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Bradford, which Emily noticed and thought about and set aside, because there was a great deal she was setting aside until she understood it better. Her father wrote to say he had heard from Eleanor that Emily had returned to Bradford, and that he was glad, and that he had always had confidence in Emily's judgment, and that he hoped matters were proceeding well. He also wrote in the second-to-last paragraph a line that Emily read twice and then carried with her for the rest of the day. "I should have asked you more carefully before this marriage whether you were certain, and not simply whether you were willing. I regret that I did not." She read it at the writing table in the morning room. She sat with it for a while. Then she went to find Thomas. How was in the east wing of all places, the part of the house that had been largely unused since his father's time, that Emily had walked through exactly once in 11 months and found cold and shuttered and covered in the particular quality of dust that accumulates not from neglect, but from deliberate avoidance. He was standing in the corridor with his hands in his pockets looking at a portrait. Emily came and stood beside him. The portrait was of an older man, same build as Thomas, same dark coloring, the same careful stillness, though on the older face it read differently. Softer somehow, as though the stillness had been chosen rather than constructed. "Your father," she said. "Yes." She looked at the portrait. "He looks like a man who found things genuinely interesting," she said. "The expression. He's looking at whoever painted this as though they're telling him something worth hearing." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He did, he said finally. He stopped. He asked questions. About everything. The tenants, the farmers, the suppliers. He knew every family on this estate by name. Not because he was required to, but because he was interested. Another pause. I was not as good at that as he was. You're learning, Emily said. He turned and looked at her. You say that a great deal, he said. Because it keeps being true. He held her gaze. In the east wing corridor with the cold light coming through the shuttered windows and his father looking down from the wall. Thomas Bradford had the expression of a man standing at the edge of something large, not afraid of it exactly, but fully aware of its size. Emily. His voice was very quiet. I would like to ask you something. All right? Before, when you came back, you said you were not ready to be finished believing in me. He paused. Is that still true? She looked at him. She thought about the cold carriage, about Harrogate, about 45 minutes of reading the same page of a book without seeing a word of it, because her mind kept moving back to the estate office at Bradford, to the accounts, to the specific quality of a man's face when he was listening. Yes, she said. It's still true. He released a breath. Then I would like to ask, he said, whether you would be willing, not required, not arranged, but willing to be my wife in a way that is different from what we have been. The corridor was very still. Different how? She said. Carefully. Precisely. Different in the way that means I ask your opinion before I have already decided. Different in the way that means I listen to what you find in the accounts. Different in the way that means... He stopped, looked at the portrait, looked back at her. Different in the way that means I am not managing the distance between us. Her chest did something she chose this time to let happen. That is a significant change in operating procedure, she said. I am aware. You'll find it uncomfortable. I expect so. You'll revert under pressure. Probably. And I'll call you on it when you do. I'm counting on it, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, the real him, the unarmored version, the one she had spent 11 months believing was there, and 4 weeks in Harrogate, refusing to stop believing in. All right, she said. He reached out and took her hand in the same way he had in the estate office after Alderton's letter. Certain, direct, without preamble, and she felt standing in the east wing corridor of Bradford Estate, with his father's portrait watching from the wall, that something had finally arrived at the place it had been trying to reach for a very long time. Not a resolution, not an ending, a beginning. The kind that is built on something solid, on honesty and hard work, and the patient willingness of two people to keep looking, even when looking is difficult. The east wing was cold. Neither of them moved for a while. Mrs. Colton found out, as Mrs. Colton found out about everything before anyone told her. She appeared at the breakfast table the following morning with the expression of a woman whose professional neutrality has been entirely abandoned in favor of something she has no intention of hiding. I've had the main suite prepared, she told Emily, setting down the tea tray with a precision that suggested the action was ceremonial. Fresh linens. The fire's been going since 6. Emily looked at her. Mrs. Colton, she said, we haven't. The morning room flowers have been refreshed as well. Mrs. Colton continued in the tone of a woman who has decided what is happening and considers further discussion unnecessary. And I've spoken to cook about a proper dinner, 7 courses, the good silver. Thomas looked up from his correspondence. Mrs. Colton looked at him with the expression of 20 years of service and 3 months of sustained disapproval. Sir, she said. Mrs. Colton, Thomas said very evenly. It is very good to have things right in this house. She picked up the empty tea tray. It has been some time. She left before either of them could respond. Thomas looked at Emily. Emily looked at Thomas. She has been waiting 3 months to do that, Emily said. Longer, Thomas said. I believe she has been waiting since approximately your 2nd week. Emily thought about the supply accounts, the kitchen fires, the Crawley family firewood, the 11 months of quiet, unacknowledged work. She thought about Mrs. Colton's face when she had arrived back at the estate in February, the relief in it, The undisguised, professionally unacceptable relief of a woman who had watched something go very wrong and had waited with the patience of someone who had faith in the eventual outcome, even when the outcome was not at all certain for it to come right. "She's a remarkable woman," Emily said. "She is." Thomas set down his correspondence. "She also told me the morning after you left that I was a fool." Emily looked at him. "Not in those words," Thomas said. "In the particular way she has of saying true things without technically saying them." "What did she say?" He looked at the window. "She said it was very good to have Mrs. Bradford in this house, and that the kitchen fires had been properly tended every morning for 11 months, and that she hoped I was aware of the difference such attention made. And were you?" He looked back at her. "No," he said, "not then." And now, the not-quite smile came, all the way this time. "Yes," he said, "now I am." The recovery of Bradford Estate did not happen in a single dramatic reversal. It happened the way Emily had always known it would happen, because she had built the schedule, and she understood its architecture slowly, methodically, one account at a time. The Eastfield parcels came back through the county court in March. The vendor contracts were renegotiated through April. The tenant relationships that had frayed under Hawthorne's inconsistent management were rebuilt through the spring, one conversation at a time. Many of them conversations. Emily had directly sitting at kitchen tables with families who had learned in the months after she left what her presence had been worth. The Crawley family sent flowers in April. James Crawley brought them himself, standing at the front entrance of Bradford Estate, with his hat in his hands and an expression of uncomplicated gratitude that Emily received with a warmth that surprised him. She was not. He had expected the kind of woman who received things warmly. He had been wrong about that. Most people who did not know Emily Winthrop were wrong about that. Thomas watched this from the doorway. He did not say anything. He filed it quietly in the growing record he was keeping, not on paper, but in the way people keep records of things that matter, of all the ways Emily moved through the world that he had spent 11 months failing to notice. He noticed now. He noticed constantly with the focused attention of a man who has understood finally and fully what insufficient attention costs. In May, Emily found him in the East Wing again. He had been spending time there, not every day, but often enough that she had noticed the pattern. She understood what he was doing, sitting with something the way you sit with something that needs to be understood rather than resolved. His father, the lost years, the fabricated distance, the portrait of a man who had found things genuinely interesting and had been surrounded in his final years by people who used that openness against him. She sat beside him on the window seat. They looked at the estate from the East Wing windows, the fields, the tenant cottages, the far line of the property boundary that was fully Bradford again. "He would have liked you," Thomas said. She turned to look at him. "My father," he said. "He would have seen you immediately, the first week. He would have asked you about the accounts and listened to what you found and trusted your judgment without requiring 2 months and a legal crisis to get there." A pause. "He was better at people than I am." "You're learning," Emily said. He looked at her. "You'll stop saying that when it stops being true," she said. "And when will that be?" She looked at the estate, at the east fields coming green in the May light, at the tenant cottages with their proper firewood and their functioning irrigation, and the small genuine improvements that had accumulated over months of quiet attention, first hers, then theirs together. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Ask me in a few years, and I'll have more data." Thomas Bradford looked at his wife. He looked at her the way he had been looking at things since February, without the careful management of distance, without the organized maintenance of sufficient control. With the full, unguarded, somewhat terrifying openness of a man who had decided after 35 years of building walls to try the alternative. It was unfamiliar. It was uncomfortable. He had discovered the only way to actually see anything. "A few years," he said. "At minimum," she said. He took her hand. Outside the Bradford estate, moved through the ordinary business of a May morning, functional, continuing, repaired. Not perfect. Not the estate it had been before the theft, not yet. But honest. Grounded. tended by people who understood its value and were willing to do the difficult work of keeping it. Much like the two people sitting in the east wing window. Much, in fact, exactly like that. The summer of 1813 came to Bradford Estate, the way good things sometimes come to people who have stopped expecting them quietly, without announcement, in the ordinary details of a morning that looks very much like other mornings, until you realize it doesn't feel like them at all. Emily noticed it first on a Tuesday in June. She was in the estate office, her estate office now, in the sense that had always been true, but was only recently acknowledged, reviewing the spring harvest projections that the groundskeeper had submitted, and Thomas was across the desk from her reading correspondence, and Mrs. Colton brought in the morning tea without being asked, and the fire was properly tended, and outside the window, the Bradford land was green and full, and working the way land works when someone is paying attention to it. And Emily looked up from the harvest projections, and looked at Thomas, at his bent head, at his hand moving across the correspondence, at the small furrow between his brows, that meant he was reading something that required thought, and she felt with a completeness that was almost startling in its simplicity, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not where she had settled, not where she had managed to arrive despite difficulty, where she was supposed to be. She looked back at the harvest projections before he caught her looking. Thomas looked up 2 minutes later. "The Ashworth account," he said. "Alderton is asking whether we want to pursue the civil claim alongside the criminal matter or separately." "Separately," Emily said without looking up. "Pursuing them together creates scheduling conflicts and gives Stanhope's remaining associates grounds to request delays. Separate proceedings move faster." Thomas wrote a note on the letter. "That was not a question," she observed. "No," he agreed. "I knew the answer. I wanted to hear you say it." She looked up then. He was looking at her with the expression she had no name for, yet the one that had been appearing with increasing frequency since February. That was not the not quite smile, and not the open, unarmored look, but something that combined both and added something else, something that sat in the specific warmth of it and did not require identification to be understood. "You wanted to hear me say it," she repeated. "You think faster than I do," he said. "I've accepted this." "That took you a while." 11 months and a legal crisis," he said. "But yes, I got there." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the harvest projections. But she was smiling. She was smiling in this precise, careful, private way of a woman who has learned not to let her face give too much away. A habit formed over years of being in rooms where her expressions were used against her, and she was gradually, month by month, unlearning it. She was not there yet, but she was learning. The letter from London arrived the second week of June, and it was not from Alderton. Thomas brought it to her himself, which told her something before she read the address. He brought things to her when they mattered. He had developed this habit without discussing it, the way he had developed most of his new habits, through the straightforward logic of a man who has identified a better approach and implemented it without ceremony. When correspondence required only his attention, he handled it at his desk. When it touched the estate's financial structure, or the tenant relationships, or any of the dozen threads that Emily had her hands in, he brought it to her directly. He brought this one directly. She read the return address. "The Lord Chancellor's office," she said. "Open it." She broke the seal. The letter was formal, careful, written in the precise language of official correspondence. She read it once quickly, which was how she read things when she was trying to understand the shape of them, and then once more slowly, which was how she read things when the shape had turned out to be larger than expected. "The Stanhope matter," she said. "They've been tracking it at the national level." "Keep reading." She did. Gerald Stanhope, it emerged, had not confined his operations to Yorkshire. The pattern that Alderton had identified, the professional targeting of complex estates, the placement of cooperative stewards, the long-term systematic extraction had been replicated across at least 7 properties in 3 counties. The Lord Chancellor's office had been investigating for 8 months following a complaint from another estate owner in Lincolnshire who had identified similar irregularities. Bradford Estate's documentation, Emily's documentation, had been instrumental. The letter said this specifically in the measured language of official correspondence that nonetheless managed to convey something close to genuine appreciation. The account records, charter documentation, and vendor correspondence, assembled by Mrs. Bradford of Bradford Estate, have provided the clearest and most comprehensive evidence submitted to this office in the course of the current investigation, and have materially advanced the prospect of successful prosecution. Emily set the letter down. Thomas was watching her. "They used my accounts," she said. "Your accounts," he confirmed. "The ones you compiled in October and November. The ones you brought to me in December." He paused. "The ones I dismissed." She heard the weight he put on that last sentence and did not try to remove it. He had earned the right to carry it, and she had learned that letting him carry it was not cruelty but respect. The respect of treating him as a man capable of honest reckoning rather than one who needed to be protected from it. "They're going to prosecute Stanhope," she said. "Across all 7 estates, yes. And the recovered assets. Alderton is already in contact with the Lord Chancellor's office regarding the Bradford claims." Thomas crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, her chair's mirror image, which he had moved to her side of the desk in March and which had remained there without comment from either of them. "Emily, do you understand what this means?" She looked at him. "It means the documentation holds," she said carefully. "It means the legal recovery will be faster than Alderton projected. It means," Thomas said, "that you walked out of this estate 4 months ago with one case, and you took the entire case against Gerald Stanhope with you. In your head. In the work you had done that no one acknowledged." She was quiet. "Without what you compiled," he said, "we would have had a local dispute, a Yorkshire matter, Hawthorne's individual theft, difficult to prosecute fully, and impossible to connect to Stanhope's broader operation." He held her gaze. "With what you compiled, 7 estate families get justice. Stanhope faces criminal prosecution. And Bradford Estate's recovery is underwritten by a national legal framework rather than a county court judgment." Emily looked at the letter. She thought about October nights in the estate office, working by a single candle while the household slept. About the filing system she had built from scratch because the existing one was inadequate. About the charter she had found in the secondary cabinet and filed under estate governance because she thought it might be important, not knowing then what it would mean. She thought about Thomas's face when he had told her she had overstepped. She thought about the cold road to Harrogate. "I wasn't trying to build a national legal case," she said finally. "I was trying to save Bradford Estate." "I know," Thomas said. "That's exactly why it worked." Alderton came that afternoon, and his careful professional manner had been replaced by something close to excitement, which on Alderton manifested as a slightly faster pace of speech and the repeated adjustment of his papers, but which both Emily and Thomas had learned to read accurately. The Lord Chancellor's engagement changed the timeline significantly. What had been projected as a months-long county court process compressed into something more decisive. Stanhope's legal team, faced with a national prosecution rather than a local dispute, began negotiating within the week. "He'll settle," Alderton said. "His lawyers have already indicated willingness to discuss terms. The criminal matter will proceed regardless. That's in the Lord Chancellor's hands, but the civil recovery for the affected estates can be settled faster through agreement." "What are the terms they're proposing?" Emily asked. Alderton outlined them. Emily listened, and then she asked 3 specific questions about the asset valuation methodology, and Alderton answered them, and then she said, "The second point is undervalued. The eastern parcels were assessed at their sale price rather than their current market value. They've appreciated since the transactions were completed. That appreciation belongs to Bradford Estate." Alderton looked at the figures. He looked at Emily. "You're right," he said. "I missed that. Counter with current market value on all 7 parcels," Emily said. "And add the administrative costs of the account reconstruction. I have those documented separately," Alderton wrote. Thomas watched. He had a specific expression during these moments, during Alderton's visits, during tenant meetings, during any conversation where Emily was doing what she did, that he had stopped trying to manage. It was not pride exactly, though pride was part of it. It was something closer to the feeling of understanding something you had misread for a long time and finding that the correct reading was better than anything you had originally imagined. He had misread Emily Winthrop comprehensively. I was finding the correct reading inexhaustible. The Stanhope settlement was reached in July. It was not everything. Settlements rarely were, and Emily had built the recovery schedule, understanding that some losses would remain. Losses, time specifically, could not be compensated, and the 3.5 years of Hawthorne's extraction had cost Bradford Estate not just money, but momentum, the compounding growth of a well-run property that had been quietly diverted elsewhere for years. But it was substantial. Substantially more than Alderton had initially projected, and materially more than Stanhope's legal team had initially offered, because Emily had caught the valuation error, and Thomas had backed her judgment without hesitation, and Alderton had gone back to the table with the corrected figures, and an expression that said clearly enough that Stanhope's lawyers read it accurately, that this was not a position open for further negotiation. They signed on a Thursday. Alderton brought the finalized documents to Bradford Estate personally, which he did not typically do. He usually sent them by post, and Emily understood when she saw his face that he wanted to be present for the moment. Thomas signed first, then Emily and Alderton witnessed, and when it was done, he shook Thomas's hand, and then with a slight adjustment of his usual manner, turned to Emily and shook hers with the same directness. "Mrs. Bradford," he said, "it has been the most instructive professional engagement of my career." "I'll take that as a compliment," Emily said. "It was intended as one." He left with his papers and his slightly faster than usual walk, and the estate office was quiet. Thomas looked at the signed documents on the desk. Emily looked at Thomas. "It's done," she said. "Most of it." He picked up the settlement agreement, held it for a moment, set it down again. "The reconstruction will take another year. Some of the vendor relationships need more time. The eastern parcels will need Emily." He stopped. "I'm doing it again." She raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" "Listing the remaining problems, instead of acknowledging the thing that just happened." She looked at him. "What thing?" He met her eyes. "You saved this estate. Not in the last 6 months, in the 11 months before you left. With no support, no acknowledgement, working alone at night with a single candle while I sat 2 rooms away, convinced I understood everything." The room was very still. "And then you left," he said, "and you took it all with you, all that knowledge, all that work, and when I finally asked you to come back, you came back, and you finished it anyway." He paused. "Why?" She held his gaze. "I already told you why," she said. "Tell me again." She looked at him, at this man she had spent a year learning to read, at the real version of him that existed beneath the careful architecture, at the person who was standing in his own estate office, asking a direct question without managing the answer he was hoping for. "Because I was not ready to be finished believing in you," she said. "I told you that in February. And now—" His voice was very quiet. A pause. "Now," she said, "I have considerably more data." "And your conclusion?" She looked at him steadily. "My conclusion," she said, "is that you are exactly who I thought you were, beneath everything. I was right to look." Thomas Bradford crossed the room. He crossed it with the directness of a man who has spent 11 months managing distance and 4 months learning not to. And he stopped in front of her, and he put his hands on either side of her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with every quality she had initially attributed to him. And he looked at her the way he had been learning to look at everything, without the careful management of distance, without the organized maintenance of control, with the full, unguarded weight of a man who had finally stopped being afraid of what he found when he looked. "Emily." His voice was rough and precise at the same time, which was exactly like him. "I am in love with you. I have been in love with you for a considerable amount of time. I was the last person in this estate to understand that which is appropriate given my general performance in this area." She looked at him. Her chest did the thing she had stopped trying to manage. "That is the most Thomas Bradford declaration of love I have ever heard," she said. "It's the only one I have." He held her gaze. "Does it suffice?" She reached up and put her hand over his. "Yes," she said. "It suffices." The news moved through Bradford Estate, the way all significant news moved through households of this kind, not through announcement, but through the particular quality of the morning. The way Mrs. Colton arranged the breakfast table, the way the footman held the door, the way Margaret appeared at Emily's room that evening with a warmth in her face that she was making no effort whatsoever to contain. "Well," Margaret said, straightening items on the dressing table that did not need straightening. "Don't," Emily said. "I haven't said anything. You're straightening things that are already straight." Margaret put down the hairbrush. "I told you," she said. "I told you 11 months ago, before you left. I told you this house was wrong without you." "You said I was too good for this house," Emily corrected. "Both things can be true." Margaret picked up the hairbrush again. "I also said that anyone with eyes in their head could see what you were doing for this estate." "He had eyes," Emily said. "He needed time to use them." Margaret looked at her in the mirror. "Are you happy?" she asked. Directly, the way Margaret asked things without softening, because she considered softening a form of not asking. Emily looked at her own face in the mirror. She thought about this question seriously, the way she thought about everything. She thought about October nights with a single candle and account books, about the cold road to Harrogate, about the morning she had walked out of this house with one case and every reason to be done, about coming back, about hands in the estate office and the East Wing corridor and the May light over the Bradford fields, about a man learning to look. "Yes," she said. "I am." Margaret nodded once. "Good," she said, and went back to the hairbrush, satisfied. In August, they rode the estate together. This was Thomas's idea. Or rather, it was the idea of the Thomas who existed in August 1813, who was a different man in specific and important ways from the Thomas who had stood behind his desk in January and watched his wife walk out with one case. The August Thomas had developed the habit of suggesting things rather than managing them, of asking questions he did not already know the answers to, of noticing when Emily's expression shifted and caring what it meant. He suggested they ride the eastern boundary, now that the parcels had been fully returned and the boundary itself re-established in the county records. Emily agreed. They rode without speaking for long stretches, which was a kind of conversation they had gotten good at, the kind that required no words, because the words had already been said, and what remained was simply the being together, which was turning out to be for both of them a more substantial thing than either had previously understood. They stopped at the eastern boundary. The fields ran away in both directions. Bradford land clearly and legally and entirely, so growing toward a harvest that would be the first honest harvest in 4 years. The autumn planting. Emily had reorganized in October. The reorganization nobody had noticed or acknowledged, the one that had gone into the ground before the first frost at Emily's quiet instruction, had been followed this spring by the schedule she and the groundskeeper had built together in March. The result was visible in the specific functional health of what stretched before them. Thomas looked at it. "My father would have ridden this boundary every year," he said. "He called it reading the estate. He said you couldn't understand what land needed unless you stood on it and paid attention to what it was actually doing, rather than what you were told it was doing." Emily looked at the fields. "He was right," she said. "He was right about most things." A pause. "I stopped riding this boundary when he died. I told myself it was sentiment, unnecessary." "Was it?" Howe was quiet for a moment. "It was easier," he said, "than standing in a place that reminded me of him, given what I believed about those last years." Emily looked at him. "Now that you know the truth of it," she said carefully, "does it feel different?" Thomas looked at the boundary line, at the land, at the sky, at the late summer light over Bradford Estate. "Yes," he said. "He wasn't choosing distance. He was being kept at it, which means he stopped. Which means the years I spent believing I had somehow failed to—" He stopped again. The muscle in his jaw worked. He would have wanted the connection. He was maneuvered out of it. "Yes. And so was I." "Yes." Thomas pressed his mouth together. "Then we will ride this boundary every year," he said. "Both of us." Emily looked at him. "Both of us," she agreed. He turned his horse and they rode back toward the estate, and the Bradford land spread around them in every direction, tended and honest and entirely theirs. The dinner party was Eleanor's idea. She arrived in September with her particular brisk kindness and her accurate eyes, and within 48 hours of her arrival, she had assessed the state of things at Bradford Estate, approved of them thoroughly, and announced that there should be a dinner. "Not a formal affair," Eleanor said. "Not an announcement. Just people who should be around the same table." Thomas looked at Emily. Emily looked at Eleanor. "Who did you have in mind?" Emily said. Eleanor's guest list was specific and entirely characteristic the Crawley family, because James Crawley's letter had been mentioned in Eleanor's presence, and she had decided on the spot that any man who wrote a letter like that deserved a proper dinner. Alderton, because he had earned it. Emily's father, who had been corresponding with both of them since February, and who Eleanor felt had apologies to make in person. Mrs. Colton, because Eleanor took one look at Mrs. Colton and decided she was the kind of person who belonged at a table rather than behind one, and said so to Thomas directly. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Arrange it." Eleanor smiled, which she did rarely and briefly, and went to find Mrs. Colton. The dinner happened on a Thursday evening in September, and it was exactly what Eleanor had said it would be, not formal, not an announcement, just people who should be around the same table. The conversation ranged across accounts and harvests, and Yorkshire law and family correspondence, and the Crawley irrigation system, and the specific difficulty of the county court's scheduling procedures, and at no point did anyone pretend the last year had not happened, which meant that everyone at the table was actually present for the dinner rather than a managed version of it. Emily's father arrived with the particular expression of a man who has written a letter acknowledging a failure and is now required to be present for the full version of that acknowledgement in person, which is always worse. He sat beside Emily at dinner and said very little for the first part of the meal. Then he said quietly between courses, "Are you all right, truly?" Emily looked at him. "Yes, father," she said. "Truly." He looked at Thomas across the table, who was talking to James Crawley about the Eastern Field yield projections, with the engaged attention of a man who has learned to find tenant conversations genuinely interesting rather than obligatory. "He sees you now," Emily's father said. Not a question. "Yes," Emily said. "He does." Her father was quiet for a moment. "I should have asked you if you were certain," he said. "Before the marriage. I asked if you were willing." "I know. That was not father." She put her hand over his on the table. "It turned out all right." He looked at her hand on his. "It turned out more than all right," he said gruffly. "That is not entirely your doing." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Across the table. Thomas glanced up from his conversation with James Crawley and found Emily's eyes, and the look between them was brief and entirely private, and contained in its brevity everything that the last year had built between them, the hard parts and the honest parts, and the long patient work of two people who had made a decision separately and then together to keep looking even when looking was difficult. Her father saw it. He looked down at his plate. "Good," he said quietly. "Just that." Emily smiled. After dinner, Thomas found her in the morning room. The guests were still in the dining room. Eleanor's voice carrying clearly the Crawley son's laugh, Alderton's measured observations. The household was warm and full and entirely different from the silent, managed, carefully maintained distance that had characterized Bradford Estate for years before Emily arrived. Thomas stood in the doorway. Emily was at the window looking at the September night. He came and stood beside her. They were quiet for a moment. "Eleanor is remarkable," Thomas said. "She is terrifying," Emily said. "I have known her my entire life, and she still terrifies me. She told me this afternoon that I owed you a public acknowledgement." Emily turned to look at him. "What kind of public acknowledgement?" She was not specific. She said I would know. He looked at the window. "I've been thinking about it." "And?" He turned to face her fully. "I want to establish a formal account review process," he said. "Documented, chartered, built into the estate's governance. Quarterly with annual reports to the county land registry. And I want your name on the charter as co-administrator of Bradford Estate accounts." Emily was very still. "Thomas, not as my wife," he said. as the person who actually does it, with your name attached to it in the records permanently, so that in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, when someone reads the Bradford estate accounts, they will know who built the system they're reading. She looked at him. She thought about October nights with a single candle, about 11 months of work that existed in the records and nowhere else, about driving away with one case and everything she had built invisibly behind her. "That is a very significant change to estate governance," she said carefully. "Yes," he said. "You'll have to file amendments with the county registry. Alderton is already drafting them." She looked at him. "You asked Alderton before you asked me." "I asked Alderton whether it was legally possible," Thomas said. "I am asking you whether you will accept it." A long pause. "It will raise questions," she said. "People will let them." His voice was very level. "Emily, you saved this estate. You saved it before I deserved saving, and you came back and finished saving it after I gave you every reason to stop. Your name belongs on the charter." He held her gaze. "And I am done managing the distance between what is true and what I am willing to say aloud." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." He nodded. She looked back at the window. "Thomas." "Yes, you should know," she said, "that when I came to Bradford Estate 11 months ago, I was willing but not certain." He listened. "I told my father it turned out all right." She looked at him. That was an understatement. He looked at her with the open, unarmored, inexhaustible expression that had been waiting for 35 years for someone to stay long enough to find it. "Emily Winthrop," he said, "you are the finest thing that has ever walked through the door of this estate." "I walked out of it too," she said, "with one case." "I know." He took her hand. "I am deeply grateful you came back." She looked at their hands. She thought about all the ways a life could go, all the roads away from difficult things, all the easier arrangements, all the perfectly reasonable decisions to stop looking when looking costs too much. She thought about a cold carriage and a gray Yorkshire sky and 45 minutes of not reading a book. She thought about truth that wasn't willing to leave quietly. "So am I," she said. They put Emily Winthrop's name on the Bradford Estate Charter in October of 1813. It was the first time in the estate's recorded history that a woman's name appeared as co-administrator of its accounts. Alderton filed the amendment with the county registry without comment, which was its own form of comment. The county registrar reviewed it twice, which was also its own form of comment, and then recorded it because it was legally sound and correctly filed. And the documentation was the most thorough and well-organized submission his office had received in years. Thomas told Emily this. "Of course it was," she said. "I filed it." He looked at her with the expression she still had no name for. "Yes," he said. "You did." In the years that followed, people spoke of Bradford Estate, the way people speak of places that have found their right shape after a period of being wrong, with a specific admiration that goes beyond financial recovery or legal resolution that recognizes something less tangible and more durable. They spoke of the account system, which became known in Yorkshire legal circles as a model of clarity and prevented 2 attempted frauds against neighboring estates whose owners had been advised to study Bradford's methods. They spoke of the tenant relationships which Thomas rebuilt through the spring and summer of that year, with the engaged attention of a man who had finally understood what paying attention required, and which flourished in the particular way that relationships flourish when the person at the center of them is genuinely interested in the people at their edges. They spoke of Thomas Bradford himself, with the careful acknowledgement that people reserve for those who change in ways that matter. Not the surface changes, not the changed circumstances, but the changed way of being in the world that makes all subsequent circumstances possible. And those who knew the full story, Alderton, Mrs. Colton, Eleanor, Margaret James Crawley, spoke of Emily. They spoke of a woman who had arrived at an estate with one case and no illusions, and more competence than anyone had thought to ask about. Who had spent 11 months doing essential work in the dark unacknowledged. Who had brought evidence to a man who dismissed her and lost and driven away in the rain and come back anyway. Not because she was required to. Not because she had no alternative, Because she had looked at Thomas Bradford past the armor, past the careful architecture, past every wall he had built between himself and anyone who might matter, and she had found what she believed was there, and she had been right, and she had not been willing to let the right thing be defeated by the difficult thing. She had never wanted his fortune. She had never wanted his estate, his title, his social standing, or any of the measurable things that constituted the visible life of Thomas Bradford of Bradford Estate. She had wanted the man who existed beneath all of it, and she had been stubborn enough and precise enough and brave enough in the specific quiet way that courage sometimes looks like from the outside, not dramatic, not announced, just the sustained decision to keep looking. When looking, it is hard to stay until he was ready to be found. Some people leave with empty hands, and they take without knowing it. The only thing the person behind them never knew was priceless. Emily Winthrop had walked out that door carrying nothing but the truth, and the truth in the end had been more than enough.